Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Listen and Learn series. In this episode, we're specifically going to talk about lynching and the historical connotations that it has in the African American community and overall in American history. So, the reason why I'm talking about lynching is the recent events that have happened with NASCAR. If you are unaware, recently NASCAR took a stance regarding the Confederate flag. Some were in favor of it and others were against it. Bubba Wallace is an African American driver who drives for NASCAR. And within not even a week of this stance about the Confederate flag, he found a noose in his stall. Now, some say it's a coincidence, but given the recent history in our country with the death of George Floyd, the mass protests, and also the Confederate flag stance that NASCAR took, it was required, in my opinion, for there to be a deeper look into the situation to determine, in fact, if it was a hate crime or a coincidence. If you don't know the history of lynching, let me give you a brief summation of lynching. Lynching was the execution of an offender who supposedly committed a crime. Now, remember, we live in a country where you are promised a right to due process and an opportunity to be heard. But essentially, lynching denied that person of their due process of the law. So you were accused of a crime, and without being actually charged for that crime or found guilty of that crime, you were in fact lynched. Lynchings began to rise heavily in the United States after the Civil War ended, and we talked about the Civil War, which took place in the mid 1800s, and it was right around the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, which followed the Civil War. There's some history that shows that, of course, lynching was not only done to African Americans, but it was done in or disproportionately in very large numbers to African Americans. For example, over 75% of the reported lynchings were to African Americans for allegations that they had committed crimes, often which were unsubstantiated. The huge percentage of white people who were actually lynched were because they were in favor of or speaking up for injustices that were happening to African Americans. So we know that most of the lynches that actually took place were in the South. But the history tells us that the purpose of lynching was to instill fear in African Americans and to continue to perpetuate white supremacy that was known to be legal in the slavery days. And Jim Crow, in the Jim Crow days, we know that lynching was something that was done. It was done openly. Did you know that lynchings were done in the public setting? Many people would go to watch as bystanders. There are many now famous photographs of lynch victims, and you can see the bystanders in the backdrop, often all white crowds in the background with smiles on their faces. Did you know that there were lynching postcards that were popularized around the times that lynchings were taking place, and that oftentimes lynchings were known to be festivals? There were other things going on. It was a big gathering where you came and watched the lynching of a person. Did you know that lynching, oftentimes the disfigurement of the person lynched, the African American person lynched, that body parts of that dismembered person would then be used as souvenirs or artifacts to continue to celebrate the fact that a person was lynched? When talking about lynching, I have to talk about Ida B. Wells and her anti-lynching campaign. It hit home for her around 1892 when she actually saw three young African American businessmen who she knew be abducted and lynched. Oftentimes, again, lynching was used as scare tactics. The story is that there were business people, black male business people, who were taking business from a majority grocery store, and when told that they should discontinue their business and refusing to do so, they then were in fact lynched. Some would know Emmett Till. He was the 14-year-old African American who was lynched in Mississippi in 1955 after being accused of offending a white woman by making a pass, allegedly, at her at a family grocery store. He was brutally beaten and killed, and his killers were acquitted. His mother made it a point to ensure that the funeral was an open casket funeral, so you can see exactly what his remains look like. The photo is now something that you can find easily, and you can see that his face reflects nothing of what his then photograph of him looked like. So those are examples of lynching and the history that this violence plays on American history. So yes, if you hold up a noose, that is offensive to someone that is African American. If you mention a noose, if you mention lynching, if you mention any of these things, they are in fact offensive. Now, keep in mind, we're not talking about 100 years ago. Emmett Till's murder was not even 70 years ago. So that's the very recent history that we're talking about. The very recent history that we have parents and grandparents who are still alive that can say they would be Emmett Till's age if he was still alive, born in 1941. I encourage you to do some research on lynching and what a noose actually means so you can be educated about why it is in fact offensive. Again, whether the findings of the FBI showed that that noose was in his stall, in Bubba Wallace's stall, coincidentally or not, you have to understand that in the climate that we're in right now in America, it warranted for further investigation. So I would encourage you to just dig a little deeper to see exactly what the historical connotations are behind nooses and why they are in fact unacceptable. As always, thank you for watching. I encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit the notification bell so you are notified when I post a new video. I look forward to continuing to take this journey with you. So go and continue to be bold.